G'day and welcome to the channel. My name's Luke Rowe. I'm a learning scientist and university lecturer who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. And in today's episode, I'm going to be speaking about 5 tips to help you succeed in your studies. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on things that are going to help you succeed in your senior years of high school. So for those of you who are trying to get into university, who are trying to get good jobs at the end of high school, this is a recipe for success for your studies to get you there. Before we begin, I want to help contextualize this video in relation to a boy called Bob. Bob's a young man standing at a significant crossroads in his life. Like many of you, Bob was sports obsessed, diligent, but easily distracted from his studies. He enjoyed school, but never pushed himself to his full potential. At the end of year 10, tired of his circumstances, Bob seized what seemed like a golden opportunity, an apprenticeship in carpentry offered by a friend's father. But life threw a curveball. Just 3 weeks in, Bob sustained a back injury. He was bedridden for over a week and unable to work or play the sports that he so dearly loved. He was forced to take a long, hard look at his life. And during this low point, he had a heart-to-heart discussion with his mother. She shared her deepest regret about her own school experience. Her greatest regret was never reaching her academic potential. Who could she have become? Could she have been a doctor, an engineer, a businesswoman? She lamented the fact that she would never know because life had cruelly passed her by. Hearing his mother's story, tears trickled down Bob's cheeks. Realizing that he still had a chance to change his future, Bob made a bold decision. Bob looked his mother in the eyes and declared, "I'm going back to school and I'm going to give it everything I've got." As he began his senior years of high school, he knew there were 2 paths ahead. The difficult road of dedication, discipline, and success, or the easy path of minimal effort, excuses, and inevitable disappointment. Bob chose to walk the path of success, and he enrolled back into school and commenced his final years of study. Now imagine Bob was one of your closest friends and he came to you for some advice. What's the advice that you would give him? If I was standing here having a conversation with 17-year-old Bob, these are the 5 tips for study success that I would give him. Study tip number 1 is first decide on what you want to achieve. In other words, what's your definition of success? This is really a goal setting exercise. So some of the best ways to set goals are based on the work of Edwin Locke, who founded this idea of goal setting theory way back when, and he looked at several features of goal setting that help you succeed in achieving that. Let's have a quick look. The first of these is to write about your goals at length. So be as specific as possible when you're writing those details about your goals. Make sure they're challenging yet attainable goals so that they're not unrealistically difficult or beyond you, but they're not so far within your comfort zone that you could achieve them in your sleep. Also think about a visual record of your progress so that you can help monitor and measure your progress towards achieving that goal. Look at action-orientated words when you're formulating and writing down the formula for success in achieving your goal. So break it down into actionable components rather than talking about simple outcomes like I want to achieve A+ in everything. I would redirect you to say, what are the steps involved in getting there? These are process-related actions rather than outcome-based goals. Right, so the process-related goals will help us achieve our outcome-related goals. So yes, I want to get 98.9 on my study scores, up in the top percentile with my grade point average, whatever those outcomes may be. Refine the language that will help you get there. What are the steps necessary to get there? I'm going to be studying at least an hour and a half of homework every night after school. I'm going to be getting coaching and tutorials from experts in the fields that I want to flourish in. Whatever those steps are to get you there is also equally important as the outcome. The other tip is to keep it private so that we don't want to go out there and start to have to fess up to people and feel this extra layer of guilt when we haven't achieved our goal, or we don't have to necessarily be accountable to people who don't have our best interests at heart. And also we have the flexibility of changing our goals without having to save face with people who think that we've broken a promise. Now, there is a common acronym to sum up some of these features of goal setting, and that is the SMART goal setting experience to make your goals specific, measurable, actionable and achievable, realistic and time-bound in how you set them, so putting a date on them and how long these things are going to take you. However, it's not a perfect framework for goal setting. I think it's a good framework, but it's not perfect. I think the key ideas are to be as specific as possible, to make them complex and difficult yet achievable. So I think those are the two really big features: specific goals that are difficult yet achievable, and really stretch you and inspire you into achieving them. So what does the evidence say about the impact of goal setting on study success? As I mentioned before, there's a lot of lessons we can gauge from Edwin Locke's work in the goal setting theory. In a fantastic review piece published in 2019 in the journal Motivation Science, Edwin Locke says this: "These analyses show that people with specific challenging goals reliably outperform those with do your best goals because the latter type of goal is interpreted too subjectively. Moreover, the degree of goal challenge or difficulty is linearly related to performance given sufficient skill or ability. We concluded that the most effective goals for increasing performance are those that are specific and difficult. Specific goals in and of themselves affect the variance in performance only to the degree that performance is controllable. Goals should be challenging yet attainable." So a great summary of those two key elements, being challenging yet attainable and specific in how you set them. You'll also be encouraged to know that these findings were highly generalizable. For example, he found this: "We reported evidence of generality across 88 different tasks, over 40,000 participants in 7 countries with 10 different outcome measures, over time spans ranging from goals that were achievable in 1 minute to several years, with different experimental designs and correlational designs, different settings such as laboratory, simulation and field studies, and goal sources such as assigned, self-set or participatively set. And studies also showed that goal setting could be used successfully with groups and teams, divisions, and even small organizations." Now, Edwin Locke talked about 4 different mediators that will determine whether these goals can be achieved or not. The first is choice, effort, persistence, and strategies. And he said it like this: "Goal research showed that goal mediators include choice and attention, effort and persistence, and having relevant strategies for goal attainment is a 4th mediator." So to summarize that, the choices that you make, the effort you put in, the amount of perseverance, so the effort over time, and the goal setting strategies and the strategies you use to achieve those goals. These are the actions that you're willing to take to achieve your goals. He also discovered 4 moderators. So mediators will determine whether a goal goes ahead or not, and a moderator will determine the degree to which you're able to capture that goal, to attain that goal. So they determine the strength of your actions. The first was feedback, and that is the feedback you get on your way to achieving a goal. Are you on track? Are you not on track? This is why visual motivators are so powerful. Another moderator is commitment, which is the extent to which you're willing to sacrifice for that goal. What are you willing to give up to achieve that goal? The third moderator was your ability. So we all have natural abilities that we can help cultivate. So it's not just about the effort that we give to our tasks and the achievement of our goals, but it's also the raw ingredients we bring to that. And both are important. We don't want to start to trivialize nature or nurture. Both are important. I always like to reiterate what Donald Hebb said when he was asked about the importance of what contributes most to learning and intelligence. Is it nature or nurture? His answer was, of course, what contributes more to the area of a rectangle? Is it its length or its width? But it's obviously both. And so I love that rhetoric from him. The final moderator on whether you will achieve your goals is the situation you find yourself in. So does this goal need you to be really wealthy in order to achieve it? Does it need you to have a lot of free time so you can study uninterrupted? What stage of life are you in? Have you got little kids at home? Have you got siblings, sisters, brothers, friends or family who are going to constantly interfere with your goal? Have you got other circumstances that are going to make it difficult, like health-related issues? So our situations do matter, and we need to set goals within the boundaries and in relation to those circumstances. So to summarize the advice on goal setting from the research of Edwin Locke, the father of goal setting theory, he says this: the best procedure here is to assign specific challenging learning goals. Self-efficacy and strategies mediate learning goal effects. Learning goals are especially effective when negative feedback is given on the performance of a task that is experienced as highly complex. So what he's really saying here is that the task critical feedback benefits these complex goals. So if you have highly complex study goals where you've got complex tasks that you want to achieve, it's really helpful to attain feedback on the areas that you are weakest at. And you understand, why did you not achieve this task in the way that you wanted to? So where are you at? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Now focus on your weaknesses, and here's the next steps that you need to take to get beyond those weaknesses and turn them into a strength. And one final quote from this review that I think is really helpful is about the demarcation between what we call intrinsic goals and achievement motivation. Let me read the quote. Intrinsic motivation properly means loving an activity just for its own sake, regardless of how well one performs it, e.g. walking, or just for the sake of contemplation, e.g. music. It means loving what one is doing. The goal-setting theory is based on achievement motivation, which involves striving to meet a standard of excellence. It means not just doing, but also doing something well, e.g. attaining a sales objective. Ideally, the two go together, but they can vary independently, e.g. hating being a lawyer while still trying to be excellent at it, loving tennis while being indifferent to attaining excellence or even to improving. So the idea is that study isn't always fun or easy. You don't always love it for the sake of it. We don't always have that intrinsic motivation there in the actual task at hand. But the key is to override your impulse to quit and not just measure an activity's worth by the amount of emotional enjoyment you get out of it. It's still worthwhile because it's attached to a bigger goal than your feelings or your subjective feeling of pain or discomfort or even despondency that you get when you struggle in attaining a goal. So that achievement mastery and achievement motivation is a really important reason. Excellence for excellence sake, doing it well because you can and you have the ability to do it well, not just because it makes us feel good. So the question I have for you is, what are your study goals? If you would like, pause the video so you can write those down now before moving on with the rest of the video. Study tip number 2 is to punch procrastination in the face. So the question is, how do we procrastinate with procrastination itself? I've got 6 different methods for you to try. The first is start small, easy, and interesting. This is really like picking the low-hanging fruit of the tasks you've got to do. So when you've got a list of all of the things you want to achieve, start with what interests you most, what you're internally driven to achieve. Once you've got that down, you've got some momentum. You're no longer having to have what we call entry friction. This is the point at which you have a difficulty even starting a task. That's often the hardest part of the task, is the beginning. Once you've got that behind you, you have momentum. So start small, easy, interesting. The second point is to consider your future self. Who will you become if you end up doing the task? Is that somebody you prefer to be? How will that make you feel if you achieve that task and actually get on with the job? Versus, who are you going to become if you don't do this task? You know, that can make us feel uncomfortable enough to get our butts into action and begin when there's a lot of friction in front of us or a lot of anxiety and we're procrastinating that beginning. It just takes a look into the future of who we'll become if we don't do it to prompt us into action. So think of both. Who will your future self be if you do the task? Who will your future self be if you don't do the task? The next one is to make a consistent schedule so that your routines do the thinking for you. When you start to study every night between, say, 7 o'clock and 10 p.m., you're going to be feeling uncomfortable if you end up skipping that routine by the time you're a few weeks into it. So your body and your mind and your whole scheduling will reposition you and orientate you to feel like that scheduling, that routine, is going to scaffold your momentum to beginning your homework between 7 and 10 again, the subsequent night. And when you have those excuses, the schedule might be enough to push you in the direction to say no to those excuses and begin. The fourth tip is to be compassionate to ourselves if we veer off course. Sometimes we tell ourselves, this really negative self-talk, and we say, I'm not going to amount to anything. I procrastinate all the time. I never do what I think I should do. And you start to deride and devalue yourself. But you've got to be compassionate to yourself. So what does that mean practically? It means telling yourself, instead of saying, I'm not going to amount to anything, I always give up easily, I can learn from this. Maybe I haven't done this task yet, but I'm going to begin now. I might have lost an hour procrastinating on my phone. However, I'm going to begin now. And to start now is always better than to put it off in the future. All right, when's the best time to do something? It's yesterday. When's the second best time? It's now. The next tip is to have short work periods so that you can have incentives and achievable, realistic goals with your study habits. For example, if I tell you you've got to study for the next 10 hours, you're not going to be willing to start. You're not going to be motivated to begin in the first place because it's so overwhelming. It's like being at the base of Everest and saying, climb up the top there. You want to make this achievable by breaking it down into small chunks. Can you take the first 5 steps? Can you take the first 10 steps? And it's the same with study. One of these methods is called the Pomodoro method, where you study for 25 minutes on and you have 5 minutes off for a couple of rounds, then you have a larger break thereafter. These are different methods that don't have too much science. It's more common sense driving that. But the main thing is to make your tasks broken down into smaller chunks so that they're more realistic for you, and you're less likely to procrastinate if you don't see a mountain of work ahead and you've only got a little molehill to traverse. The final tip is to turn off this. This is my personal procrastination device, and I'm an expert at it. When I've got this thing near me and it starts to ring or I get on social media, I can't stop. So big tip for you, if you want to succeed in your studies, is to go and pick this thing up, turn it on to silent or do not disturb mode, and put it too far away that you'd have to always get up to look at it. I usually put mine in another room where I can't see it for my periods of intense work that I don't want to be disrupted for. So take the temptation, put it in the other room. Now, I can't emphasize this last tip enough because really they're personal, professional procrastination devices that we carry around in our pockets, these things we call cell phones. And we know that a lot of us become easily addicted to that, to the point where it's difficult to get our eyes off our phone screen and begin study, let alone all the other things we've got to do during the day. One of the really depressing statistics I heard from Justin Romano, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, he said around 50% of smartphone users meet the basic criteria for phone addiction. Teens use around 9 hours per day, and that was in 2023 data. He referred to these things as addictive ticking time bombs in your pocket. So put that addictive ticking time bomb in another room before you begin your studies. So what's the evidence say about overcoming procrastination? Now, there was an interesting meta-analysis by Van Erd and Klingseed that came out in 2018, and this is what it found. They had 44 studies involved with around 1,173 participants across those studies, so on average, pretty small sample sizes. Their aim was to see how we can reduce procrastination. So they were asking the question, which studies will show us how we can reduce procrastination? They looked at 4 different types of interventions. The first of those was self-regulation strategies. These were strategies that focused on training self-regulatory skills like time management, goal setting, emotion regulation to establish productive work habits. Then they looked at cognitive behavioral therapies. These were the therapies that aimed to change negative thought patterns into positive ones. And enhanced self-efficacy. This is the extent to which we believe ourselves capable of achieving a certain outcome in a certain domain. For example, mathematics or reading or sports. So we have this self-belief around what we think we can achieve, and that's what we can work on with cognitive behavioral therapies. Then they talked about other therapeutic approaches. This includes methods like paradoxical interventions. This is one where you can say to yourself, well, I don't really care. I don't want to start it. And you start to use reverse psychology. Some people say that it can alleviate some of the anxieties around your stress and the importance, perceived importance of the task. Once you alleviate that anxiety, you're more likely to begin. So it's a bit of reverse psychology for yourself. There's a whole lot of alternative strategies out there like that that were positioned into this category. And the fourth and final category they looked at was the strength and assertiveness frameworks for alleviating procrastination. These things concentrate on building self-efficacy, again, by focusing on an individual's strengths and their resources, and fostering assertiveness to prevent procrastination. So again, it's being assertive with yourself and putting boundaries around all of the temptations that could encroach on your time. So taking the phone and putting it into another room might fit that strategy. So what did they find in the results of this meta-analysis? And I quote, "Based on our meta-analysis, we conclude that procrastination decreases after an intervention. The average effect size denotes a medium to large decline, indicating that treatment is worthwhile in general. Follow-up measurements indicate that procrastination does not return to its level before training, nor declines more over time. Rather, the effect remains stable. Cognitive behavior therapy shows larger effect sizes. Possibly the larger effects of this therapy are due to the intensity of the intervention. Delivery of the treatment, such as the duration, we show that these characteristics neither change the average effect sizes." So obviously that's really promising to hear that most of these interventions do help alleviate procrastination. However, we want to go to the most powerful interventions, and that was cognitive behavioral therapy. So what does that look like in the context of our procrastination with our studies? So here's a few ideas, and it's basically around changing thought patterns and behaviors. The first one I would say is to identify the challenging, irrational thoughts that start to swim around in our minds when we procrastinate. This is to recognize negative thoughts that lead to procrastination of studies and to challenge them and replace them with more productive, positive thoughts. The second one is start the goal setting and the prioritizing. We often say that you can't say no to something unless you first have a bigger yes. You've got to break tasks into smaller, more manageable goals and to prioritize them into your workload so it seems less overwhelming. Then there's the time management techniques that you can use with CBT. Tools like calendars, planners, to-do lists, other task organizers and apps to help you set and achieve and monitor deadlines. Then there's the self-monitoring, reflective aspect of CBT. This is about keeping track of progress and reflecting on the strategies that are working for you and those that aren't, and not kicking yourself while you're down for engaging in strategies that don't work, but telling yourself, hey, this doesn't work, put it back on the shelf, grab a different strategy off the shelf and give it a go. If it works, stick to it. If it doesn't, go back and try again. And one other thing I would say is that it's not just you who suffers when you look at your phone and procrastinate your studies, but you can actually become a distraction for the people around you. There was some interesting research that shows that when you look at social media or you're off task on your electronic device in your classroom or in your study location, it actually draws the attention of the people who are sitting adjacent to you away from their studies and towards your electronic device. So this is where our procrastination is contagious and our distractions are contagious. So don't only think about the impact it's having on you and your future self, but also around your peers and the people that you want to succeed around you. So the big question I have for you is, how are you going to limit procrastinating? How are you going to procrastinate with procrastination? The third tip is to find your why. And this really means discovering and developing the deeper purpose for why you're studying in the first place. So that it's not just the goals that are driving you, but you've got some fundamental purpose that's embedded in the very fiber of your being that you're attaching this goal to. The goal hangs off that purpose, right? And it could be that you want to make a huge contribution to the world. I know Steve Jobs used to say that he wanted to put a dent in the universe with the impact he was having. And he was maniacal and driven to achieve that. That was his purpose. And I believe he did that. What sort of purpose are you going to hang your hat on and scaffold your goals around? So discover your why. Here are a few tips in how you can do that. The first is to make it bigger than yourself. Think about your why in relation to your future self, not just your present self, but the person you want to become. It's what you're doing now is a gift to your future self. All the hard work you put in now is a gift to your future self. It's going to make your future self proud of all the hard work you put in now. Also think about your parents and honoring your family's investment in you, your siblings and the faith they have in you, Or potentially, if your siblings and you don't get along, proving them wrong. That could be part of the friction that you want to overcome. Also think about your friends and the people who've supported you and the loved ones you have who are rallying in your corner, and they could be your why. And every time you feel like quitting, picture them cheering you on. And that's your why that you're going to hang your hat on and really use to motivate you through the times where you want to give up. So here's 4 questions I have for you. Who will you make proud? Who will you help? Who will you inspire? And who will you disappoint? Right? Who will you make proud? Who will you help? Who will you inspire? And who will you disappoint? And on that last one, I know it's not that self-evident, but in order to succeed in some areas, we've got to be prepared to disappoint others. You know, it's saying no to your friend, your best friend even. I don't want to go out this weekend. I'm studying all weekend. I want to get that good score. It's being able to say, not this weekend, next weekend, or after the exam's due. Right? So it's disappointing and being prepared to disappoint others in that last one. And if you ever want to take a little bit of a pulse check to see if you're on track in finding your why, ask yourself this question. What am I prepared to give up for this goal? What does it mean to me? What am I sacrificing and what am I prepared to sacrifice? When we have a big enough yes, we can say no to anything. And that means giving up to go up in life. So the question I have for you is, what is your why? Find your why. Now, what does the evidence say about finding your why and getting a sense of purpose in your studies? Let's have a look. The first theory that I want to point to in helping you contextualize this sense of purpose in your studies is Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory. They had a classic paper. It's one of the most cited papers in all of psychology and education, and it was called The What and Why of Goal Pursuits, Human Needs and Self-Determination of Behavior. Now, self-determination theory hinges around 3 different things: autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And if you've got all those 3 things, they're the recipe for having a deep sense of purpose and drive in the activities that you're engaging in. This intrinsic motivation that just spills out of you so that you feel like you're moving towards your goal with a lot of zest and enthusiasm, and it can often feel automatic. So self-determination theory, it's a fantastic theory. If you want to look more into the literature, I've got the research paper on screen. Another theory that really props up this sense of purpose in what you're doing as a source of motivation is by Riff and Singer's work in 1998 on psychological well-being. So they found in this paper, it's called The Contours of Positive Human Health. And in that paper, one of the first pillars of positive well-being and health is the sense of purpose in what you're doing. And they also found that leading a life of purpose was associated with a higher sense of life satisfaction, greater resilience, and overall mental health. And there are, of course, several books written on this. I think Simon Sinek's work on starting with why, the question of why, of purpose, is a really good book. It grounds you in the fundamental aspects of goal-setting theory and motivational theory. Now, the 4th study tip for success is a package deal. And it's about this idea of what I call the 4 pillars of powerful practice. It's a model I developed myself. I've got a book coming out on this very topic next year in 2025. And it's the R.I.D.E model, R-I.D.E. The first pillar is retrieval practice. The second pillar is interleaved practice. The third pillar is distributed practice. And the 4th and final pillar is expert or deliberate practice. So what do I mean by practice? These are the activities that you engage in to get better at something. That's the things that you repeatedly do to get better at something. That's what I mean by practice. To make it as powerful as possible, you got to follow the R.I.D.E method. What's that mean? Well, let's look into the first pillar, retrieval practice. So what is retrieval practice? Well, it's really just bringing long-term memories to the forefront of your mind into your working memory so that you can consciously think about it. And when we do that, when we retrieve a memory from the long-term memory into our working memory, that process in itself strengthens that retrieval and the access pathways to that memory. It's a very powerful intervention and study technique for you to get better at accessing that information in the future, which is exactly what you want to do when you undergo a performance like an exam or a presentation or you're writing an assessment task or something of that nature. Now, typically these can be just really trivial quizzes. So asking yourself multiple choice questions, true or false questions. You could engage in past examinations, presenting ideas to your friends, being able to speak about it is forcing you to retrieve it from the long-term memory to be able to manipulate the words in your working memory and to articulate them to others. It could be that you write down information on just a blank piece of paper as what we call a brain dump, everything you remember about a topic. Or it could be just building concept maps, which help you start to contextualize ideas in relation to one another, so that you now have a sense of mental hierarchy about which ideas are more and less important and how they overlap or contradict each other or are not related to each other. So these are all forms of retrieval practice, but perhaps the most common and most powerful is practice testing. Testing yourself through quizzes, short answer questions, extended response items where you can bring that information to the front of your mind and see if you know something or if you don't know it, and it reveals that unto you. Now, one of the reasons why retrieval practice is so powerful is because it really is an upheaval to all of our intuitions about learning happening from the outside in. It really says that learning doesn't just happen when we squeeze information from the environment into our heads. It's in fact more about the other way around. It's about getting our prior knowledge and testing it against reality. We all build mental models of the world around us, and we're constantly generating those models to test them against reality. And when we find contradictions, such as when we start to conjecture or guess the answer to the question on an exam, that then has to meet the cold reality of an error, of a mistake, of contradictory information when you start to look at the answer and realize that you didn't have it right in the first place. That tension there, the gap between what you know and what you thought you know, can be closed. You can start to learn as to why you made a mistake, and so our generative model gets refined and we start to improve that model, so next time we have got the same question, we're less likely to make a mistake. That is essentially the process of learning in a nutshell. So learning is more about getting information out of your head than putting information in your head. It's testing the information that you've built, the ideas that you've built, testing them against reality. And we can do that with practice quizzes, short answer questions, asking friends to listen to your explanations and testing your ideas with your peers or your teachers and asking for feedback on that. Another thing I want to say here is that retrieval practice helps us overcome what we call retrieval blocking. That is when we have information that's in our long-term memory, we know it's there, but we can't retrieve it successfully at a time where we need to. Say, for example, when you're undertaking a presentation and you forget what to say next, or you're in a rehearsal for your drama where you're trying to put on a nice Shakespearean play, you forget the lines. Why is that? You know they're stored in your brain somewhere, but the anxiety perhaps is making it difficult to retrieve. Well, retrieval practice helps you overcome that friction. So the more you retrieve that information, you overcome that retrieval blocking. So it's not just about having the information in your head, it's about being able to successfully bring it to the front of your mind. That's why retrieval practice is unique. It's not just about the fidelity of storing the information in long-term memory. It's about the process of being able to create an information highway so that it can be easily brought to the front of your mind. Now, the good news is that retrieval practice can be done in so many different ways, so it means there are so many different ways to succeed with your studies. And my question I have for you is, how are you going to include different types of retrieval practice in your study routine? So what does the research have to say about retrieval practice? Now, I think it's important to contextualize what the research says retrieval practice is in the first place. And I think one of the authorities on this is Pooja Agarwal. She's a professor at Washington State University, and she said it this way. Retrieval practice is an active attempt by a student to recall or recognize and then reconstruct their memory of knowledge during initial learning. Now, you'll often hear of retrieval practice being used synonymously with the term practice testing or the testing effect. So what does that mean? Well, Kubik and colleagues said that the testing effect refers to the finding that tests are not merely opportunities to assess one's learning, but are potent learning opportunities themselves. More than a century of research has revealed that retrieving previously studied information enhances subsequent memory for that information. Now on screen is a table from the forthcoming book that I mentioned, Powerful Practice, that looks at 3 different reviews of different types of retrieval practice studies and testing effects. They include Stoller and Creed in 2020, where they found a moderate to large effect size. Yang and colleagues in 2021, who also found a moderate to large effect size on academic achievement in the classroom. And of course, the lady I mentioned earlier, Pooja Agarwal and her colleagues in 2021, who looked at classroom-based achievement scores and how retrieval practice impacted that. And again, we're converging on a similar effect across all of those major reviews, moderate to large impact on academic achievement. So they do make a powerful difference, and it's an important principle to guide your practice. Now, I've heard a lot of people espousing the virtues of concept mapping, and I've even done it myself. And I think concept maps are a really powerful study strategy, but when they're going head to head with retrieval practice strategies like practice testing, they actually fade into the background. So they're not as powerful as practice testing strategies and conventional retrieval practice. So concept mapping can be thought of as a form of retrieval practice, but it's not as powerful as answering short answer questions, case studies that help you bring information from the back of your mind to the front of your mind in an organized way, multiple choice quizzes, etc., etc. So think about those. If you've got only a limited amount of time, am I going to do some concept mapping or am I going to do some practice quizzes? I'd always choose the practice quizzes, unless of course you're getting really sick of it and your motivation's low. I go to the concept mapping thereafter. Now, I want to just quickly mention that retrieval practice will not be as powerful if you don't couple it with feedback on the errors and mistakes that were made and the ways in which people can improve that, the strategies that they need to use to overcome those errors in the future. So what good is it to do a practice test to find out you were incorrect, to have no clue as to how you're going to overcome or answer that question correctly in the future? Your practice testing has to be coupled with the feedback, not only numerically around the score that you got, say 7 out of 10, 70%. That's not enough. You've got to understand what happened to the 30% that you got wrong. How did you get the 70% right? And what are you going to do to improve it next time? So that feedback piece from teachers, from peers, and from yourself, your metacognitive self, that is the self that allows our reflection and that reflective inner voice to critique ourselves. All of that can be a rich source of feedback on how to improve for next time. Now, the second pillar of powerful practice is interleaved practice. So what's that mean? That's basically like randomizing and mixing up the different topics, concepts, and skills that you're trying to improve and learn about. All right, so if I'm going to be doing a 3-hour homework block at night, and I've got some maths homework, I've got some literacy homework and science homework, I'm going to mix up some of that into my study, so I'm not just doing a huge block of maths homework. Then within those blocks of study, where I'm doing maths homework for say the next hour, I'm going to be mixing up the problems of not just today's assigned problems, but some of the problems from the previous few weeks, last week, the week before, and mixing those in so that when I'm answering questions in relation to mathematics, I'm mixing up the different types of information that I have to retrieve to answer questions. And the reason this is so helpful is because it improves our ability to identify and diagnose different problems. And that's particularly important in areas where they're highly similar, or different categories of information and problems are so similar that sometimes we misplace a solution, or we give it the wrong problem solution fit. And if we apply a square peg in a round hole with the problem mismatch, it's not going to work out well for us. So we need to refine not only our skills in solving the problem, but to make sure before we solve the problem that we're going to be applying the correct solution framework. So we've got to make sure it matches the type of problems, and we've properly identified the type of problem that we're engaging with. For example, in mathematics, you might be finding it really difficult when you've got, say, 50 questions to go through to recognize which questions are about simple interest, compound interest, and exponential interest, because the equations present themselves fairly closely. They visually are quite similar. So in order to be better at picking up on the subtle differences and distinctions between those different problem types, the best way to do that is to present them to yourself in random or mixed fashion so that you don't know what to expect and you then have to focus and zoom in on various subtle features of those equations that'll be a tell. They'll tell you, act as a cue to then say, hey, this is a compound interest problem. Or no, this is an exponential interest problem. So that's a kind of skill set that we often miss out on when we study in big blocks of predefined categories, like all the next 10 to 20 questions are compound interest questions. The next 20 questions after that are simple interest questions. The next 10 questions after that are exponential interest questions. When we know what to expect, we don't have to do the work of identifying the problem type to then discover where the best fit for a solution is. Interleaved practice will help you overcome that deficit. And of course, this matches the context of our performance, because when we get an exam, we very seldom understand what the order is going to be on that exam. So these exams present themselves in mixed fashion, well, so too should our study strategies and our engagement in homework and study in preparation for that examination. So my question to you is, how can you mix up your study so that you can be better at identifying the subtle differences in problem types and different categories of what you're learning? Now, what's the evidence say about this? Well, there's a paper I like by Douglas Rowe and Melissa Hartwig that said that interleaved practice is a form of distributed practice where a student mixes up the order of different problems, tasks, concepts, and learning activities within the same study period. There was also a major review released in 2019 by Brunmar and Richter, and they said that the overall impact of interleaving on academic achievement was moderate to large, a Hedges G of 0.42. They found that it was best for visual categorical distinctions. So for example, if you're doing an art course and you're having to, as a part of your studies, discern subtle differences in different painting and art styles, then you're going to be wanting to do some interleaving and randomizing your ability to recognize and detect the subtle distinctions and differences between those different artists so that you can name them on the spot. All right, so very powerful for that type of learning, categorical topic-based learning, especially when and to the extent that those topics or categories are easily confused. You want to improve your discriminability power by studying in interleaved fashion. One of the interesting things about this review is it also found a negative impact on academic achievement for learning words. So learning foreign words as an example there. And part of the reasoning here is that why interleaving can be so difficult as a study strategy for learning new vocabulary words, new foreign language words, is that the interleaving can actually create an interference effect with the memory and the context that helps us interpret and memorize words in the first place. Words are so importantly situated within a context or a semantic network that when you extract them and try and isolate words from their context, they lose all meaning. Without that meaning and that schema, that model or contextual aspect of the semantics or the phonemes, the graphemes, all of the aspects of language that the words appear within, without that context, these words become very difficult to store meaningfully in our long-term memory. So let's give you a quick example of how you can apply interleaving to your studies. What would it look like? Weinstein and colleagues provided a really good example in their paper called Teaching the Science of Learning. It was published in Cognitive Research Principles and Implications. They said, for an example of how this works, interleaving practice can be used after studying the peripheral nervous system for a few minutes. Students can switch to the sympathetic nervous system and then to the parasympathetic system. And next time, students can study the three in a different order, noting that new connections they can make between them. So it's not rocket science, but it is an unintuitive discipline that you have to bear upon your study habits to start to interleave the different subtle categories that you might otherwise stumble on. Now, an important aspect of this is that interleaved practice is often contrasts with this idea of what we call blocked practice. Now, I'll just put a visual on screen so that you understand the distinctions here. You can see there on the diagram above, again from Weinstein's paper, Weinstein and colleagues' paper, that interleaved practice would be about doing a different topic in that first cell represented by red, different topic represented by blue in the second cell, green in the third cell, and in having a random order at which you engage in those topics thereafter. Whereas blocked practice is more about putting all of these commonly linked topics into a single study sitting, sandwiching them or blocking them into a big chunk. As you can see, the first 3 cells are blocking the practice together, second 3 cells blocking the practice together of that topic, and then the third 3 red cells blocking into a common category of study, rather than having to do the work of discerning and discriminating what types of problems you are seeing. You already know in advance, and so you don't have to do that problem solution fitting process that comes with interleaving. Now, the third pillar of the powerful practice model is distributed practice. And this basically means studying with spaces in between subsequent study events. So once you've learned something and you've successfully been able to retrieve and recall that information, so you've tested your initial knowledge, you've got the understanding there, any subsequent study session should be spaced apart from that initial study session. All right, so that's called the spacing effect. That's what we talk about when we talk about spacing our study apart and the impact it has in boosting your learning. So in a nutshell, it involves implementing a schedule of practice that spreads study activities across time. It helps boost learning and lowers stress because you spread out the study over time. It's not as stressful and concentrated. It's kind of like the opposite to cramming. And the research shows very clearly that it boosts our learning, even when it doesn't feel like it's going to boost our learning. Sometimes our intuitions are very wrong, but it really does boost our learning. And it also takes away a lot of the stress because we no longer have to do the opposite to distributed practice or spaced practice by cramming and doing everything the night before. The really stressful way to study, it's not very effective because the brain works by the principle easy come, easy go. If you do it all easy by concentrating your studies into a single night or evening before the exam, it's going to be disappearing in the next day or two because easy come, easy go. We don't want to do that. We want to spread out our study over time and teach our brain that we're going to continue to have to memorize this information because we're saying, hey, we're re-encountering this material again and again and again. It must be important. That's one of the heuristics our brain uses to identify the importance of something and therefore whether it's worth remembering and storing in our memory systems. So how does it look? Well, it might look like if you've got a test in 2 weeks' time and you've got to study a really important text for that test, you might study it every second day. So spacing it out, making sure that your initial study session wraps your head around that text so you truly understand it, that you can successfully answer questions about it. Once you've got that, revisit it every second day so that in the lead up to the study, you're constantly reinforcing and strengthening those memories. And the advice here is to practice like you're watering a plant. That is, don't pour all the water on it at once and hope it can be okay for the next 3 months. Do little bits often. A little bit of watering every couple of days is going to keep the plant alive and flourishing rather than pouring it all on at once like you would if you're cramming. So same principle with study. Don't cram, don't pour all your time into the study in one sitting. Spread it out over time. So what does the evidence tell us about the impact of distributed practice on academic achievement? There's a huge amount of evidence in support of this study strategy. And the fact is you can actually look at this from 2 perspectives. From the teacher's perspective, where they can actually set up study routines and instead of following a textbook's order at which they approach different topics, where we'll approach chapter 1 of a textbook, learn about the information in there, go to chapter 2, and we'll ask questions on chapter 1 at the end of that. Study chapter 2, ask questions on chapter 2. That's all behind us. Go to chapter 3, ask questions on chapter 3. That's all behind us. We rarely revisit that. Spaced practice or distributed practice would involve going back to chapter 1 in a few weeks' time and trying to revise the material so that you can then test yourself and see if you've remembered it a few weeks later or a few days later. From the student's perspective, this involves imposing a discipline upon yourself to revise and space your study out over time. Again, avoiding the temptation to cram and ensuring that you really do the good hard work of a study routine that spreads out your plans and spreads out your study over time. So spaced practice might look like studying on day 1 and then having 4 days off, studying on day 5 or 6, having a couple of days off, studying on day 9, and then having a couple of days off again before you do the exam or the test. Whereas if you were massing your practice, you would be doing nothing for the first few days until a night or two before the exam, concentrating all of your study into that time. Right, so these are contrasting ways to study. We know from the research it's far more powerful to space it out over time than to cram it all in a single sitting. And again, as with the other strategies, we can often be wrong with our intuitions in thinking that this isn't working because we get frustrated and we don't have the instant gratification we get when we cram things and concentrate our study into a single sitting. So that frustration leads us to misbelieve or erroneously believe that there's less learning going on. But that's not true. So sometimes our intuitions are wrong about our learning. And in fact, the more difficult thing is to space out your study over time and to ignore your intuitions in full faith that it's going to pay off in the long run with better and more robust learning. Now, there was an excellent paper by Carpenter and colleagues released in 2022 on the benefits of the spacing effect and spaced retrieval practice in particular. I just want to read some of the information that I extracted from that and summarize some of the findings there. Well, we know that it helps us consolidate information and memories when we have the spaces in between study sittings. So once we've engaged in a study and we have a bit of a break from it, that information begins to consolidate in our memory system. So giving it a chance, particularly if we've got sleep interspersed in those spaces, that's going to also help because sleep can causally improve our learning outcomes. It's not just the spacing that sleep provides, but it's the rehearsal, it's the mental simulations that we engage in when we engage in deep and high quality extended periods of sleep that'll help with the learning and the spacing of that learning. The second thing is to elaborate and engage in deeper processing in the first place. So again, there's opportunities to have self-reflection, to discover contradictions or questions or gaps in your knowledge in between those study sessions so that you come back at your second, third, fourth sitting or study session with a reinvigorated sense of curiosity and zest in what you want to know and what you, in terms of what you're aware of and what you're not aware of. And another reason why it works is because it establishes a more robust repertoire of what we call contextual cues with your learning. So if you're starting to spread out your study over time, you're going to be doing it in different places at different times, when you're feeling different, when you're in a different study location or with different people or different circumstances. All of those, when you're bringing that information back to the front of your mind in a subsequent study episode, are going to act as re-encoded retrieval cues. So bringing the information to the front of your mind to think about it in a study period when you're sitting at McDonald's having an iced coffee or an ice cream or something, that context is going to mean that when you re-encode that information, some of that's going to be embedded in there. And then when you go to the study hall and you start to re-engage in that study session and remember that information again, some of the information from how you felt and the time of day and the local environment is going to be encoded, re-encoded in that memory again, and so on and so forth with all the places and times and states that you were studying in. This enriches the repertoire of retrieval cues so that when we're faced with an unpredictable setting or circumstance or state in which we are forced to retrieve that information, such as an exam or a test, we're ready because we've seen and been in plenty of different situations and under many different circumstances and already practiced retrieving that information successfully. So our learning is robust to the circumstances. So it's a really powerful way to ensure that you gather up all the different retrieval cues and encode that and embed that in your memory networks. So you've got many different doors to enter the same room of that memory. The other thing that's really powerful in this literature on the spacing effect or distributive practice is the idea of transfer of your domain of knowledge from one domain to another. It means that when we're learning about probability theory, we might be able to transfer some of what we've learned in binomial probability theory to, say, polynomial probability theory. Or it could be a physical skill where you're learning to shoot a basketball, and when you've learned that, it transfers to your ability to throw a netball or to throw a football or something of that nature. So when we practice in one area, it can often have spillover effects to benefit other areas, and all the more if you engage in distributed practice of that original skill. And here's a really fascinating thing that I found in this Carpenter study in 2022 that I think is worth paying attention to. They found this. They found that in the initial study session, if you overlearn it, that is, you learn something so that it is just automatic to you, you repeat successful retrieval of that information or that knowledge over and over again, multiple times, that makes all subsequent restudy episodes in the future much more efficient. Right? You'll get to the answer successfully more quickly if that initial encoding process is done to the point of being automatic. So you can see there, overlearning during your initial learning session makes you more efficient at spaced relearning into the future. And they considered two different conditions. There was the standard initial session where the student would study terms and definitions until they were correct. Once they were correct, they set the study aside and didn't come back to it till a couple of days away. Then there was the other condition, the overlearned initial session. Right? They would study terms and definitions until they were correct in recalling that information at least 3 times. So 3 times as much success in the initial study episode. And what was the result of that? They found that the overlearned initial session, the sessions where they recalled the information successfully 3 times on the terms and definitions, cut the rate of relearning time down by around 10 to 30%. Right, so if you want to shave a whole lot of time off your subsequent study episodes and make your subsequent study episodes and revision episodes much more efficient, make sure you have a high quality and automatic sense of knowledge and recall about those topics and, in this case, terms and definitions that you were studying in the first place. If you want to really nail those in future study episodes and make that a really quick and pain-free process, do it well first up. The initial encoding really counts. So my question to you is, how can you maximize the space between your restudy episodes over time so that you can maximize the distribution of your practice events in your study routine? Now, the fourth pillar in this 4 pillars of powerful practice is this idea of expert, or otherwise known as deliberate practice. What does that mean? So that means we're talking about practice that is goal-orientated, pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone, focusing on improving your weaknesses, so targeting your deficits and trying to turn them into strengths, and working with a professional or a coach or a teacher to gain feedback on how to do just that. So really, it's a macro framework of making your practice so powerful that you approach it like an athlete. That's why we talk about it as expert practice. So you're looking at it just as an athlete would, where you're sitting there with a coach or a teacher to help plan out the best possible study routines, maximizing feedback to correct the errors and to focus on constantly improving so that no study is wasted and that you don't just go into mindless rote learning. Right, that would be a travesty according to this type of practice. It's all about expert practice. So in a nutshell, expert practice is about identifying your weak spots in your knowledge, in your learning, in your skills, and then working on those with targeted, deliberate, focused practice, mastering them, and constantly seeking and getting feedback from an expert, another expert, who's going to help you improve in those areas, getting feedback on how to improve those weaknesses so they turn into strengths. If there was a recipe book for this, it would have been written by the late and great Anders Ericsson. He had a book that I highly recommend. It's called Peak, and he had at least 4 ingredients for this. He talked about effort plus time plus focus plus coaching equals expert practice. So what was that recipe? Effort, time, focus, coaching, including feedback, equals expert practice. And really, just to sum it all up, it's about approaching your studies like an athlete would approach their sport. Right? When they're practicing for that sport, they are serious about it. They seek all the methods possible to improve. That's how we should be if we want to excel in our studies. So the question I have for you is, how can you approach your study in the same way that an elite athlete will approach their sports? So what does the evidence say about this area of expert deliberate practice? Now, I mentioned this book before by the father of this idea of expert practice, Anders Ericsson. So he died a couple of years ago, but he left a great legacy of research behind, including the book Peak that I mentioned. In that book, he describes a whole range of characteristics of expert practice, and I highly recommend you read it. But just to summarize an example of how expert practice would look. Say that you were trying to incorporate the principles of expert deliberate practice into your study routine. The first thing you do is draw up a structured study program that maps the time between now and the final day of your studies, or the exam day or the assignment day. Whenever the final day of achieving your goal is due, you want to map that time out. The next thing you want to do is break down this overall study program into a weekly plan. Once you've done that, you'll include specific goals or objectives for each of those weeks and ensure that each of those weeks includes shorter and more intense study sessions rather than single protracted study sessions. You then want to schedule within each of those weekly study routines at least one of the study episodes with an expert to give you feedback on the areas where you're weakest and how to improve those. And you'd make a routine of that. So it might be every Tuesday you get tutoring advice, or you stay in for your lunch break so that you can get advice from your maths teacher or your physics teacher or your chemistry teacher who's going to help you improve your weaknesses. Now, once all of those things have been optimized in your study schedule, Anders Ericsson would make no mistakes in giving you the advice that you've got one more place to look to improve your outcomes, and that is to invest more time in your studies. Right? So all other things being equal, if you just improve the amount of hours you throw at studying, at trying to improve in your craft, you're going to be better than the next person who just simply does less of what you're already doing. Right? So time is a big factor in getting us returns on investment of that time towards excellence or expertise in a particular domain. Now, this is not to say that you should study in unlimited quantities. Of course, we've got to do things in moderation, including the amount that we invest in our study. Otherwise, we could be compromising our sleep and our overall health and well-being. And then once we do that, it's going to defeat the purpose of throwing extra hours and effort into our study. So at the point at which you're finding yourself out of balance and burning out and you're skipping sleep, all of those factors that are wonderful for your actual learning in the long run, that's when you're doing too much. So recognize in yourself and in your routines where that line is between not doing enough and doing too much. Now, on a little side note, what's really interesting about this idea of throwing extra time into your studies or into your area of expertise, Malcolm Gladwell got on the bandwagon after reading Anders Ericsson's work, and he started to popularize this idea of the 10,000 hour rule in his book Outliers. Let me just read a quote from that. In fact, researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise, 10,000 hours. 10,000 hours is the magic number of greatness. 10,000 hours is the magic number of greatness. But what did Anders Ericsson have to say about that? Well, some years later, when he published his book Peak with Poole, who helped him write the book, he said this: "No, the 10,000 hour rule isn't really a rule. This rule is wrong in several ways." He went on further to say this: "The rule is irresistibly appealing. It's easy to remember, for one thing. It would have been far less effective if those violinists," and that's the people in his original research project that Malcolm Gladwell read, "if those violinists had put in, say, 11,000 hours of practice by the time they were 20. And it satisfies a human desire to discover a simple cause and effect relationship. Just put in 10,000 hours of practice at anything, and you'll become a master. Unfortunately, this rule, which is the only thing that many people today know about the effects of practice, is wrong in several ways." So you heard it from the expert of expertise, Anders Ericsson, who said the 10,000 hour rule is not a rule. Don't start repeating this to someone else that you've got to be practicing for 10,000 hours to be an expert in anything. It's absolutely not true. There is just too many variables at play. Let's get rid of this rule. Let's stop repeating this myth, because it has been busted long ago. Now, there's been some large-scale reviews that have really put this idea of expert practice or deliberate practice under the spotlight, and they've rightfully scrutinized this this body of work by Anders Ericsson, and they found that it perhaps isn't as it's hyped up to be, isn't as effective as it's hyped up to be, but never did they find that expert deliberate practice had no effect on learning. It was always a question of whether it had a smaller effect or a very large effect, and it's probably true depending on, both of those things are probably true depending on which field of expertise that you're trying to acquire and accelerate in. So in some areas, there are other factors that will determine expertise. I imagine in basketball, to be an expert player in basketball, obviously genetics, opportunity to engage in sport, so being in a high SES area. You know, if you're in poverty, you're not going to practice sports much. You're going to be too busy trying to earn a living. If you're less than 6 foot tall, no chance in the NBA if you're in the male NBA, perhaps a little bit if you're in the female NBA, but even then you'd be struggling. Just all of these other factors are at play. In contrast with that, there are other sports where practice is really, really important, things that we aren't born with. So chess, for example, is a sport where clearly people who practice more are more effective at that sport. Now here's my fifth and final study tip, and that is to follow the grandma rule. What is the grandma rule? Well, this is to imagine yourself having a conversation with your grandma, or it could be another grandparent, whoever was a meaningful figure for you in terms of an elder that is full of wisdom and ready to share it with you. So picture that person in your mind's eye, and you're sitting down with them and you're asking them, hey grandma, what sort of advice can you give me for the year of study ahead? How can I make sure that I'm successful in my goals? Well, she's going to tell you these things. She's going to say, eat well, sleep well, exercise regularly, keep good company, and believe in yourself. Those are the 5 things. Eat well, sleep well, exercise regularly, keep good company, and believe in yourself. So as long as you hold fast to those things, I think you're going to be in good stead to succeed. Follow the grandma rule and look after yourself. So the question I have for you is, when you picture speaking with this wise elder, this grandmother figure, what are they going to say to you? What advice are they going to give you to succeed, not just for this year ahead, not just for your studies, but for life? When you tap into that wisdom, you tap into the wisdom of the ages, and I encourage you to do just that. And if you're lucky enough to have a grandfather or a grandmother alive, go and ask them. Ask them what their advice is. I'm sure they'd be willing to share it with you. Now, maybe some of you want to know what happened to our dear friend from the beginning, Bob. He wasn't just a hypothetical. I was using him as an alias for myself. This was the situation I found myself in, and fortunately for me, I ended up getting in the top 1% in my studies and finishing at the top of my school. And I've never looked back. I've been in love with this idea of learning ever since, and that's why I've become a learning scientist today. I absolutely love it, and I hope you share my passion. No matter what you want to do for your career and with your studies, there is a scientific recipe that will help you get there, and I hope this video has been beneficial to you. I'm just going to close with a single quote that I hope encourages you to put in the effort to attain excellence in whatever goals you set for yourself and your study. And this is a quote by Dean Briggs. He said, "Do your work, not just your work and no more, but a little more for the lavishing's sake, that little more that is worth all the rest. And if you suffer as you must, and you doubt as you must, do your work, put your heart into it, and the sky will clear. And then out of your very doubt and suffering will be born the supreme joy of life." Believe it or not, in an age where we've come to nearly deify leisure time, we have virtually lost sight of the fact that nearly all our satisfactions and rewards will come not from our leisure, but from our work. So on that note, I encourage you to do your work, put in the effort, and achieve your goals. Thanks so much for listening.